Hi, I'm Mark Gorton, and I'm here today with Charles Montgomery, a journalist and author of Happy City, which is a great book about a lot of ideas surrounding the livable streets movement. And he's been nice enough to visit us in New York, and where we're standing on the Lower East Side in Sarah Roosevelt Park on a beautiful spring day where lots of livable streets activity. One of the things that I really liked about your book and the way you write is that you talk about urban design in terms of happiness, which is a really unusual way. I mean, a lot of people talk about transportation and architecture, but could you explain a little bit about the interactions of urban design and transportation with happiness? I mean, what do they have to do with each other?
Well, we know that for much of the history of urban planning and architecture, the people who build our cities, who build public spaces, who create buildings and city systems, often they will tell us they are building for our happiness. I mean, it's the end goal of everything all of us do anyway, except they rarely provide evidence to demonstrate that they are making us happier with their creations. So I found this very curious, and looking at the last couple of decades of terrific work being done in neuroscience, behavioral economics, and psychology, we're actually starting to gain some evidence that tells us a little bit of the effect of the urban system on our own well-being, on how we feel, on how we treat other people.
So what makes for a happy urban environment versus a sad urban environment?
The key element is social relationships. So the most powerful ingredient of human happiness is strong and positive social connections. So the city is most successful when it facilitates great relationships between people. The places we live and the urban systems in which we live influence our happiness in ways most of us never imagine. So, for example, for the last 80 years, we've been building cities and urban systems that actually drain social time out of our lives. The group of people who are least likely to trust their neighbors, have dinner with their families, do favors for neighbors, vote, volunteer, etc., are people who live on the exurban fringe, people who are entirely dependent on cars to get around, and whose social time is being corroded by the dispersed city.
We spend a lot of time working to reduce the amount of automobiles in the city and create public spaces. And I know intuitively that these are great places. Like when you do it and you feel it, you're like, this is where I want to be. There's something almost biological that tells you when you're in a friendly place. Mm-hmm. But there's now actually empirical studies that back up this intuition. So, I mean, why don't you just start off, give me an example of a successful place?
Well, it's funny you should say that because we're in one right now. Back in 2011, I worked with the BMW Guggenheim lab and a neuroscientist named Colin Eller to test the psychophysiological effects of various public spaces. We started in the Lower East Side, we started on East Houston Street, and we found a couple of things. First of all, Colin attached skin conductance monitors to all these tour participants, dozens of people. And then he hacked some BlackBerries so they could punch in a subjective rating. How happy do you feel in the moment? Well, the most powerful thing we learned was that if you're exposed to nature, even a little bit of nature, you feel happier. So this park right behind us, which is a senior's garden right here in Sarah Roosevelt Park, almost immediately upon exposure to this garden, the tour participants felt much happier. So what surprised us is they also felt significantly more aroused, more excited. But this plays out in all our streets, and it plays out in architecture as well. We found that these big box style environments, not just in the suburbs, but when you big box the central city, when you take away all the street interaction from a building facade, for example, in the Whole Foods just a couple of blocks from here, where there are very few doors, windows, very little going on, people are less happier there than they are in the old jumbled up tenement blocks. Because there's more people over there. There's more going on. It's more social.
But I mean, you would think that if you want nature, and this is what makes you happy, it would seem like the exurbs would make people way happier than the city. So where's the disconnect there?
If you're just seeing nature from your car as you're driving, you're not able to absorb as many of its benefits as you are if you are actually working in your garden. And I spent a lot of time with super commuters in Southern California. These people didn't actually have gardens because they had no time to garden.
We as animals basically have very basic needs, and in terms of human interaction, and that urban planners, transportation planners, architects actually have to be conscious of that and actually build places to make people feel comfortable and facilitate human interaction. So how do they do that?
I would say, first of all, it's good to be guided by evidence. And cities are starting to do that. We only have to look at the work of Jan Gehl to see that once you start measuring something like pedestrian activity, policymakers start paying attention to it. When Jan Gehl came to New York City and actually counted pedestrian crowding on the sidewalks, pedestrians being pouring out onto the streets because of this crowding, this evidence can be used to design differently. So in New York City, it meant creating more space for pedestrians in some cases.
It's hard to measure happiness. I don't expect that you're going to find leaders of cities strapping happiness monitors on people. That's probably not a realistic thing. So what are things that they should be planning to do? I mean, you talked about counting pedestrians, and I know people count traffic. Like, what are proxies for happiness? What are healthy indicators that might be easier to manage for than happiness?
Yesterday, I spent the day in Jackson Heights, and looking around this neighborhood, mixed use, opportunities for lots to happen, for lots of social engagement, enough density to support great transit, walkable destinations, lots of small stores. And another thing, I think a lot of cities can learn from New York City's traditional neighborhoods, this idea of mixing uses. There's a school out in Jackson Heights that sits on top of a layer of retail, small scale retail. So if you live in that neighborhood, your kid can go to the school, but then you can go shopping beneath the school.
What is the connection between the automobile and happiness? And what are the things that we've missed along the way that we really need to realize now?
Well, surveys around the world on commuter satisfaction suggest the people who feel the most joy and the least fear, rage, and sadness are people who walk or bike to work or school. It's fairly conclusive. The question is, if that's the case, why aren't more people doing it? We know that 60% of people in cities would like to try biking around. That's what they say in surveys, but they won't do it because it's too uncomfortable and it's too scary. And unfortunately, our cities have designed those choices out of most people's lives. So what cities need to do is to create more opportunity and more freedom by building that infrastructure in again, creating safe, separated bikeways. This is essential. Over here on East Howson Street, when my friend Colin Eller, the neuroscientist, attached skin conductance monitors to measure arousal, when crossing the street, participants' arousal shot up. It was a very scary experience. So cities talk a lot about minimizing danger and pedestrian and cyclist deaths. But there's also a relationship between that infrastructure and simply how these experiences feel.
I think most people are still not making these connections. So how do you get people to make these connections? Because again, if you walk up to someone and say, you should have your city be a happier place, everyone's gonna go like, yeah. But when you say like, well, and you should get rid of that parking over there, then other people will go like hell.
It's a good question, and it's very difficult because the nugget of this problem, again, a lesson from behavioral economics is that as a species, we're actually not that good at maximizing utility, or this is the economist's expression for maximizing happiness. We get it wrong all the time. For example, a Swiss study found that the longer people's commutes, the less happy they said they were with their entire lives. Now, this wasn't asking people, are you happy with your commute? They separated the issues. And what that suggests is people were choosing to make longer commutes that actually made them less happy. So they were choosing a bigger house, or they were choosing a higher paying job over whatever benefits might be provided by a shorter commute. So we all have a very tough time choosing the right thing. Now, let's face it, for the longest time we've left these decisions up to planners, policymakers, mayors, and they need to take the responsibility to get it right, to help the rest of us by creating environments where we have more freedom and where we stop subsidizing the options that make life more difficult.